The genetic advantage isn't enough. It's also their obsession that's going to have them continually seek out any possible advantage that they can get, which includes having to use highly correlated with androgenic activity, especially in the brain. And if we're talking about trauma, most of the time there are some really cool online quizzes that you can do to narrow down the fields that you would be good in. So they're pretty notorious for their sexual behaviors. So in this video, I want to break down what kind of traits and life setup tends to create a hyper-successful person. Not necessarily somebody that you should fully become, because a lot of these people are pretty unethical and manipulative, but they are absolutely worth studying because if you look closely, there are patterns that just keep showing up in people that are at the top. And so doing research for this video, I think the most important aspects to cover are going to be obsession, genetics, the ocean personality traits, environment, networking, hormones, and risk-taking. And so we'll start with obsession, which is different than passion, because a lot of people are passionate about something, but they still keep it in its place. They keep it in check, right? They'll take breaks. They'll buy into the whole thing of work-life balance. They'll let themselves get distracted, and they make room for, other interests which take away and get themselves distracted. Whereas the hyper-successful person is usually a pretty unbalanced person. They are the ones who have found something that their brains cannot stop thinking about, or they have found this feeling that their brain just can't stop craving, and that leads them to continually do the thing that they're obsessed with. And so a majority of their thoughts and actions are aligned towards one goal, which is like the next problem that they need to solve or ways to get better at their craft. Even though they have a lot of other obligations, it's often just a means to be able to go do the thing that they're obsessed with, and so they will do it with a smile on their face, you can say. A lot of young guys have experience with this with video games, where you will do that chore or you will finish that schoolwork as fast as you can, simply as a means to go and allow yourself to play that video game that you are obsessed with again. And so the reason why obsession is such an unfair advantage is because it removes a lot of the internal negotiation that slows down normal people from going from one task to the other. The average person has to continually convince themselves to stay on track, where they want success in their life, but they also want to maintain balance. They also care about what other people think, and so they never end up starting. They also avoid discomfort, and they just want room to mentally back off. Versus the obsessed person, they usually don't have this fight, so they can just repeat the same work even if it's boring. They can put themselves out there. They don't care what other people think as much, and they're more willing to take risks because they are so like tunnel vision onto this obsession that they have. All of this without needing to reconvince themselves and re-motivate themselves every few days. And so this is why having too many passions can actually paralyze people, because you still have the same amount of mental energy. It's now just going to be spread across a bunch of different goals instead of letting you compound all that energy into one main goal. So what happens is you never really rest because you have so many passions to work on, but at the same time you never can go deep into one of them that allows you to cross that threshold of work and time that is needed to create hyper success. And so that doesn't mean that these dominant hyper successful people only care about one thing, because nobody's really that one dimensional. But what they do instead is they find a way to combine a lot of their interests, and more importantly, and this part's really important, they learn how to combine the feelings that they are obsessed with into one main thing. Could be that winning, status seeking, proving people wrong. Those are the things that their brain really craves. And so that person might go into a sport, they might create a startup, they might even go into crime. You know what I mean? There's so many different places that this person could go. So it's not that they actually enjoy that activity necessarily, like that field necessarily. They enjoy the emotions that they get out of it. And sorry, I should say not just enjoy, but like they are obsessed with that. Let's compare it to somebody else. A person who is obsessed with mastery and problem solving, they might end up in something like engineering or research or something like chess, right? Not necessarily somewhere where you are going to get high status, unless you're really, really good at it. But it is the feeling that their brain is basically obsessed with. And so it just so happens that people that are in high power positions, they're generally obsessed with status and dominance over other people. And a big factor for that is their hormonal profile and their hormonal sensitivity, because a lot of the time extreme ambition is highly correlated with androgenic activity, especially in the brain. And so they don't necessarily need to look like they are extremely masculine or androgenic, but it's, the activity of it in their brain. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of these people in power, a lot of these famous people who are trying to, become more famous and expand their status, they're pretty notorious for their sexual behaviors, since androgens also have a huge role in sex drive. And, that's one of the things that could be motivating them, one of the feelings that they are obsessed with. But, if we take a step back, it's important to realize that the key isn't necessarily, what do you like doing always, but it's also what emotional state do you like to be in, right? Once you figure that out, it can be much easier to pick the field that gives you that same core feeling through just different expressions, right? Because a person could be successful in so many different avenues. So you don't need to necessarily be, stressed about trying to find that one thing that you like. It could just be that thing that you are, that really gives you the thing that your brain craves. And if we think about this, after being hyper focused and after being so obsessed, once hyper successful people build enough status, money, and freedom in that first lane, that's when they usually start exploring their other interests more openly. And they can do that much easier because they have things like money. But let's be real here, obsession is not enough. Genetics play a huge factor because you can be absolutely obsessed with something and still never become exceptional at it. The biggest example is, like, everybody knows that one short guy who was the most dedicated person towards basketball. This guy worked his ass off. He just loved the game more than anybody else. But, he was never going to make it that far because genetically it just wasn't there for him. Instead, something that could have been better is to become maybe a coach or, even an influencer that's documenting their experience, because that plays more into their genetic advantage. And so obviously there's no one gene that's going to create some hyper successful person. We have different advantages based off of our genetics because humans evolved in so many different ways. There's different environments, different climates, different foods, diseases is a huge thing, altitudes, migration. There's so many things, right? And evolution itself doesn't just work through one, thing. There's mutations, there's like selection, genetic mixing. So we can't deny that, even if it isn't socially acceptable to say, we can't deny that everybody is equal at everything. But the mistake is, like, when we turn this into some sort of ranking based off of one aspect. Like if we only are looking at muscle building genes, and the people that aren't good at this, we kind of just disregard them. But instead, what the hyper successful person usually does is they'll go into the area where their genetics are considered advantageous. Instead of playing the same game as everybody else, they figure out, not only the thing that they're obsessed with, but also the thing that they are naturally good at. If we encompass this whole thing, the concept is called ikigai, but that's going to be a whole different video that maybe I can eventually make in the future. So in the physical domain, it's very easy to see people play to their strengths. The MMA is a really cool example of this, where they all have the same goal of trying to beat up the other guy, but they just do it in different ways. The John Jones Daniel Cormier fight is a really cool mini case study on this, where you see, like, Jones has a 10-inch, I think more than a 10-inch advantage in wingspan, and so you can clearly see the difference in their fight style, where, like, one person's trying to keep the fight further and one person's trying to keep it closer. And honestly, those fights are really cool, just in general, to see how you can play to your strengths. So I'll probably rewatch that fight again pretty soon. You even see this in team sports, where, like, you see a guy in the NBA and you're like, yo, no way this guy looks like he should be in the NBA, because he isn't built like all the other NBA players. But the thing is, he knows his role so well, and he's physically built for that role, and he can do, one specific thing better than anybody else, or at least, in the top percentage, compared to somebody who can just do a little bit of everything. They might not have an actual role on the team, because, you can fill in a spot for each thing that he can do just with somebody who's even better at that role. And so most people, they can't become hyper successful through a physical domain. There just isn't enough, opportunity for that. Very few people, are hyper athletes. And so instead, there's a much better chance to become hyper successful, with your mind, right? You can make money in the physical world, manipulating physical things like a professional athlete, or with your mind, which is like maybe starting a business or something like that. And then there's also like, um, if you have like investments and stuff like that, but that's something we can talk about in life setup, which will be later on, and like environment. But even the mind aspect does have like an inheritability aspect, right? We aren't really told this as much in school and like in society as compared to like how we can see physically that two people are different height because of their genetics. But people are genetically smarter than other people. I can see why that isn't really taught or encouraged, because it is kind of depressing knowing that somebody could practice like 50% what you did and still be better just because of their genetics that they didn't necessarily work for. And even if you did work hard, there are inherited tendencies that make hard work easier for some people. Traits like conscientiousness, self-control, future orientation, and ADHD all have a substantial genetic component. There's a lot of twin studies that showcase this, and they put the big five: openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. They put that inheritability around 40 to 60%. There are some really cool online quizzes that you can do to narrow down the fields that you would be good in. I just talked about the Ocean Big Five traits. There's the Gardner Intelligence Type tests and the MBTI personality type. So those are some that you can do, but I'll go over the Big Five Ocean personality traits because we can talk about which personality traits are highly associated with high performers, and then those are also things that somebody can work on, because again, it's 40 to 60% inheritability. There is a part that you can change yourself. So high conscientiousness is probably the biggest one across most domains of who is hyper successful, and that is the trait of somebody who is able to follow through. They're able to be reliable. They have self-control. They're able to do that boring work even when it's not fun necessarily, because they know that it's going to lead to something big, and that they're building themselves up with it. It's not necessarily that like super cool rocky montage that's always happening. Like sometimes you just have to sit down and do boring stuff like administrative work, but somebody with high conscientiousness will be able to do that. The next thing in that whole Ocean personality test is neuroticism. So here you want low neuroticism, so that things like pressure, uncertainty, and setbacks don't completely knock somebody off of their course. Because a person who is high in neuroticism, they're going to pay a much higher emotional tax every time something is embarrassing, or there's some fear, or there's some imagined social judgment, and they regret things before they even happen, right? Because they're already thinking about what the negatives could be, and that makes them super likely to hesitate, overthink, and just straight up avoid or quit early, which is so brutal because so much of that hyper growth happens exactly in those uncertain periods. And so a really simple example is you have two equally good looking and competent guys who are both trying to get girls, get laid. Again, they're the same in the looks and competency, just one guy has low neuroticism and the other guy doesn't. So the guy with low neuroticism, he realizes he'll probably get rejected quite a few times. Like the odds are not necessarily in his favor, but the more that he does it, the more likely he is to get a girl. And so he's actually going to succeed compared to the guy with high neuroticism, who only thinks about, what if it's embarrassing, or, what if he gets rejected, and so he never actually takes any step, right? And you cannot get anywhere if you don't take that step. This naturally leads to extraversion, because once you can handle uncertainty without mentally collapsing because you have low neuroticism, the next advantage is being able to willingly move up socially. And so extraversion makes somebody more likely to speak, ask, pitch, follow up, start conversation, and put themselves in the place where actual opportunities are happening. That's one of the reasons why it consistently shows up in leadership research, because somebody who is a good leader is going to be able to talk to people that are even smarter than them. Steve Jobs, he had a really good quote about this, how a lot of the best companies, they look and hire smart people so that they can tell them what to do. Because at a certain level, your success stops being about what you necessarily know, but also about how you can, like, about using other people's brains and leveraging that. That's why a lot of high performers, they're going to pair extroversion with the idea that if they are useful to other people, they can build goodwill and reputation and their reputation. And then later on, they can leverage that person's help for their own benefit. So even in a selfish way, it is still better to help other people and build alliances, because you never know in the future when you might need that. The next thing in the ocean personality traits is openness. So openness is a little less obvious, but it's still super important, because openness is what makes somebody curious, adaptable, and more willing to explore new ideas, and more likely to notice patterns or opportunities that people that aren't open are just going to miss and disregard. So this matters a lot in things like entrepreneurship, investing, strategy, even content, because basically any field where doing the obvious thing is not going to get you further, you're going to need something like openness. Because if conscientiousness is the thing that helps you keep going, openness is going to help you see where should you go next. And that combination is super powerful, because a person who is disciplined but doesn't have much openness, they are going to be able to hyper focus but on the wrong ladder. That's like that's kind of like somebody who's like the best cashier in the world, super dedicated, but they're kind of just climbing the wrong ladder, versus a person who is open but also they're not disciplined. They're going to be the person that can't hold a job for more than like a month, because they're going to have the next big idea, and they're never going to build upon any of the you know 10 big ideas that they made. Got agreeableness, which is a little more nuanced, because too little agreeableness means that you're very hard to deal with, and then people don't necessarily want to cooperate with you. And then too much, you're going to get taken advantage of. So it's best to have a tit-for-tat mindset. This is a popular mindset in game theory, where you always start off by cooperating and being nice, but then if somebody decides to take advantage of you, and they decide not to help you or actively go against you, then you will match that same energy. But you also make sure that if this changes, because some people they're just not trusting at the beginning, that you also are able to forgive and then become nice. And as long as they are being cooperative and nice to you, then you'll do the same thing back to them. It's this cool experiment. Maybe I'll put up like a video card of somebody else explaining it. But really, that's the way that I think your personality trait should be, even at the hyper successful level. Touch on IQ just a little bit. And so that is also very correlated with hyper successful people, depending on the industry, but it's also quite inheritable. When I was researching this, they said about 20% of it is inheritable in infancy, then 40% in childhood, and then 60% or more in adulthood. Meaning, as people get older and older, more of their IQ difference compared to other people is statistically based on the genetic portion. So part of this difference, like why it increases as you get older, is because your environment starts to amplify that initial genetic difference that you have. So what happens is, as you get older, people are able to like choose their environment a bit more, or like their environment fits around them the way that they're wired. It's kind of like how the smart kid, they recognize early on that he's pretty smart, but he's still in the same class as everybody. But then as time goes on, they're like, hey, we got to move this guy up, or different levels start getting created, right? There's a level for some people that want to go to university and some people that don't. And so that distinction gets higher and higher, and he gets more opportunities to explore the interests that he enjoys more. So he can read more about them, he can see harder problems, he can just end up around smarter people, and that basically amplifies what was already there in his genetics, right? So that goes to show that genes matter, but so does your environment. A lot of hyper successful people, they need a scoreboard, they need a hierarchy, they need visible progress. Even a rival is an extremely important thing for a lot of these people, especially if there's multiple people that are trying to go for the same goal, and there's a clear hierarchy. If you were to beat them, those things are super motivating for hyper successful people. And that's environment is also the reason why a lot of ambitious people tend to move. So they move to like tech hubs, finance hubs, big cities. They go to the bigger gym, they go to the better school. they join a tougher league or a tougher team. Even things like these startup houses or these creator circles that we are seeing. That's just people trying to be in the environment that's going to make them more successful, right? Because a lot of the time in the place that you grew up in, being average or being like everybody else or how you previously were is just a comfortable feeling. But the thing is, if everybody around you starts becoming sharper and more connected because you moved somewhere, then your brain is going to start adjusting to that standard and compare you against them, and it's going to get a lot of things like your androgens and your testosterone to fire to signal like, hey, this guy needs to also match everybody else around him, otherwise he's going to be at the bottom of the hierarchy. So that's what the successful person understands. They understand that environment is a force multiplier onto what's already there. So life setup is also pretty important, where if you have a supportive family, both emotionally and financially, you can have a lot more runway and a lot more chances to fail before you get your big break. It means that you can take things like lower paying opportunities that are going to help you get into certain fields and like certain social circles, or you can pay for being able to move cities, spend your time building a skill like staying in university for longer, getting your PhD, um, starting things that aren't necessarily going to make you money, but they will in the long term. And also, if you keep trying, if you get more chances to keep trying, you have more chances to actually succeed. And if you have something like a supportive family holding you back, or you live in a place where the worst thing that could happen to you is you lose all your money, you go bankrupt, but you still have like a government provided house, it's going to give you a lot more chances to essentially fail and then eventually become hyper successful. The problem is when a supportive family and comfort leads to overprotection, and that can actually make somebody weaker, right? This overprotection and helicopter parenting that is kind of becoming more common now is very linked to lower self-efficacy, a lot more dependence on other people to solve your problems. And it's a hard adjustment for people to make when they want to be more independent in adulthood, when their whole childhood they were used to being coddled and told what to do. Protecting your kid without also giving them like slight exposure to things that are scary, things that are going to induce fear, but also could lead to like a really positive result, that's going to make your child super dependent instead of being capable. And if we're talking about trauma, most of the time trauma is pretty damaging to mental health, physical health, and overall it leads to worse life outcomes. But it is true that sometimes people can turn that pain from childhood trauma into fuel, right? Into fuel that actually pushes them to do things that are going to make them hyper successful. And honestly, you kind of need some of that to get you to like the very hyper successful portions, because a lot of that time it puts a chip on your shoulder, where a lot of people naturally stop because it's getting to the top is more stress inducing. It kind of makes sense to stop. People with a chip on their shoulder that become hyper successful, they're going to keep going to assert more dominance over others. The best life setup for somebody for long-term compounding would be enough support that you feel secure, and this support can come from your family, but something else that's really important is having good mentors and having good people around you that can give you some sort of support and base to build off of, and also education. But at the same time, you need enough freedom so that you become capable. And then growing up, they need to have enough challenge in their life, which can be introduced by the mentor or by the parent, or they seek that themselves so that they don't become soft. The other thing that matters a lot is baseline health, energy, and supplements. So hyper successful people need to have better mental clarity, better decision making, better stress tolerance, and fewer days where they mentally just feel like shit, so that they can go further in their goals. Because when getting to the hyper successful areas, the differences in raw ability from person to person is much smaller, and the competition is that much more cutthroat and fierce. So they need to squeeze out every possible edge as possible. And if you think that your favorite athletes aren't taking PEDs and stuff like that so that they can get that edge, you're wrong. Because when you get to that area, everybody's genetically talented in what they do. You need to squeeze out any possible thing that you can do and fix any genetic disadvantage you might have, which you can do with PEDs. This is especially true for a lot of the older guys who you would expect are starting to slow down in performance, but they just keep going and they seem like their prime is just going to continue for another 5 to 10 years when it should have ended 5 to 10 years before. A lot of these people are definitely on a lot of stimulants so that they can have more energy and work output. Testosterone is huge, not just for your muscle growth, but also for competition and status-seeking behavior. And just to end this video off, it's getting pretty long, but luck is also a massive factor. But the thing with luck is hyper-successful people, whether they have luck or whether they don't, they find ways to be as lucky as possible, or like give themselves as many chances to be lucky. Just like with that getting girls example I talked about, it is a numbers game on how much volume that you can put in, but hyper successful people make sure to pair that with their strengths and put themselves in the environment where things happen. All in all, if you enjoyed this video, would appreciate a comment on, if you learned anything, a like, and then also if you can check out some of my other videos.